The straw brim felt impossibly light in Mrs. Gable's hands, a fragile shield against the white-hot Arizona sun. She extended it towards Haruko, her smile etched with the fine lines of the desert landscape. "For the heat," she said, her voice gentle. "It is too much." Haruko's hands remained at her sides, palms flat against the coarse fabric of her work trousers. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of polite refusal that felt deeply inadequate. Before Mrs. Gable could insist, a shadow fell between them. "Ma'am," the young guard's voice was firm, not unkind, but heavy with the weight of regulation. "You know the rules. No personal items, no gifts." Mrs. Gable's smile faltered. "It's just a hat, Corporal. The sun—" "It's contraband," he stated, his gaze fixed not on the women, but on some distant point in the shimmering heat. "Please, ma'am, do not complicate my report." The straw hat hung in the space between them. A kindness offered, a rule enforced. Haruko looked from the farmer's weathered hands to the guard's polished boots, the dust of the field already settling upon them. The silence that followed was louder than any word spoken. 6 weeks earlier, Papago Park Prisoner of War Camp, Arizona. The silence was the first rule. It was not a spoken command, but a heavy blanket woven from the hum of 24 sewing machines, the desert heat, and the shared, unspoken shame. In the long wooden frame building that served as their workshop, the women worked with a frantic, rhythmic precision. Light, bleached white by the Arizona sun, poured through the high, barred windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like frantic spirits. Haruko kept her eyes down, focused on the endless sea of olive-drab fabric flowing beneath her fingers. Her posture was perfect, her back straight, a discipline drilled into her over 20 years as a seamstress in Nagasaki. Here, that discipline was her only armor. They had been sorted with an impersonal efficiency. Seamstresses separated from farmhands, mechanics from clerks, a procedure dictated by the War Department's latest directives on prisoner labor. Source: POW Labor Programs, 1944. The logic was simple. Useful hands should be kept useful. Her movements were economical, precise. She reached for the small, worn pencil stub she kept on the machine's ledge to mark a seam. It was her own, a tiny remnant from her old life that had somehow survived the indignity of inspection. The familiar feel of the graphite on the rough cotton was a small, anchoring reality in this vast alien landscape. She did not look at the other women, but she could feel their presence. A collective of bowed heads and tense shoulders, each lost in her own silent battle. At the far end of the room, an American guard stood with his rifle held loosely across his chest, his youth betrayed by the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was not a menace, merely a fixture, part of the relentless, humming machinery of the camp. As she guided another long panel under the needle, her gaze fell upon the small, golden emblem on the machine's black lacquered body. Her breath caught in her throat. Singer. The elegant, familiar script was like a ghost of a memory, a nameplate from a world away. It was the same brand of machine she had used in her shop, the one on which she had taught her own daughter to sew. For a fleeting, dizzying moment, the smell of machine oil and hot dust was replaced by the scent of green tea and tatami mats. The illusion shattered as quickly as it came, leaving behind an ache that was sharper than any hunger. This was not her machine. It was its ghost, pressed into the service of her enemy. The drone of the needles continued, a monotonous sound for a monotonous war. When a bell rang sharply overhead, the sound ceased at once. The sudden, absolute silence was more jarring than the noise had been. The women stopped, their hands hovering over their work. The day was done. As Haruko began to clear her station, the main door creaked open. An American officer, older than the guard, stepped inside, holding a crisp stack of what looked like little booklets. The officer was accompanied by a young Japanese-American soldier, a Nisei, whose clean-shaven face was a strange and unsettling mirror. He carried no rifle, only a clipboard. The officer spoke in low, measured tones, and the Nisei translated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. By the Articles of the Geneva Convention, the interpreter began, his eyes scanning the room but landing on no one. All prisoners engaged in labor are entitled to compensation. A murmur, soft as the rustle of dry leaves, passed through the women. Compensation. The word felt foreign, illogical. They were prisoners of war, not employees. The officer gestured to the booklets in his hand. You will be issued scrip, canteen coupons. You can use these to purchase approved personal items at the camp exchange. He held one of the coupon books up. It was small, printed on cheap, off-white paper, perforated into neat squares. Even from a distance, Haruko could see the crisp English lettering and the silhouette of an eagle. The object felt sterile, bureaucratic. It was an accounting of their servitude, a receipt for their surrender. It was an insult wrapped in the language of fairness. The interpreter stepped forward, taking the stack of booklets. He approached the first row and stopped before the oldest woman. But her eyes, and the eyes of everyone else, shifted to Haruko. She was their unspoken leader, the one whose quiet dignity had set the tone from the very first day. The young Nisei, understanding the silent cue, moved down the line and stood before her. He held out the coupon book. For your work, he said, the Japanese words feeling clumsy and hollow in his mouth. Haruko looked at the booklet, then at the young man's impassive face. She saw no malice in his eyes, only duty. But this transaction was not about him or the officer. It was about the line between survival and submission. To accept this payment would be to agree to the terms of her captivity, to put a price on her labor for the enemy. Her hands, resting in her lap, curled into tight fists. A quiet, unyielding pride forged in a nation that now lay in ruins swelled in her chest. Slowly, deliberately, she shook her head. Just once. A collective, silent breath was released in the room. The interpreter's hand remained suspended in the air for a moment longer before he withdrew it. He did not need to ask the others. One by one, as he moved down the rows, each woman followed Haruko's lead, offering a slight bow of the head and a silent refusal. The officer watched the ritual with a look of detached curiosity. When the Nisei returned to his side with the full stack of coupons, he simply shrugged. He walked to an empty table by the door, placed the booklets neatly in the center, and turned to leave. They will be here, the interpreter said to the silent room. The choice is yours. Then they were gone, leaving the women alone with the humming silence and the neat pile of paper that represented a choice none of them had ever wanted to make. For 3 days, the stack of coupon books sat on the table by the door, untouched. They became a silent monument to the women's collective will, a testament to their shared, unspoken pact. Yet, their presence was a constant, low hum of temptation beneath the noise of the sewing machines. Each woman felt it differently. For Haruko, it was a point of honor. For Kiku, a girl of 19 whose home was a small fishing village, it was a gnawing question mark. On the 4th day, during the short period of free time after the midday meal, Kiku slipped away from the barracks. She told no one where she was going, but she felt the weight of their imagined disapproval with every step she took on the dusty ground. The camp exchange, or canteen, was a small structure near the administrative buildings, a place they had been told of but had silently agreed to ignore. Pushing the screen door open, Kiku was met with a wave of unfamiliar scents, harsh lye soap, sweet American tobacco, and something else. Something clean and manufactured. A lone soldier with tired eyes sat behind a wooden counter, reading a comic book. He glanced up at her, his expression neutral, then returned to his reading. The shelves behind him were sparsely but neatly stocked with items approved by the Red Cross inspectors. Source: Red Cross Camp Inspections, 1943-45. Toothbrushes, tins of talcum powder, notebooks, and pencils. A small radio on a high shelf played the faint, jaunty tune of a swing band, a sound from another planet. Kiku's eyes scanned the foreign landscape of packages and labels. She saw postcards with impossibly blue skies and giant red canyons. Then she saw them, stacked in a small box. Chocolate bars, wrapped in brown and silver paper. She could not remember the last time she had tasted chocolate. A lump formed in her throat, a sudden sharp pang of longing for a life of small, simple pleasures that now felt like a dream. It was a foolish, childish thing to desire, yet the feeling was overwhelming. She felt a hot flush of shame. Her gaze moved past the sweets and landed on a stack of thin, pale blue envelopes and matching writing paper. Beside them were pens. Her heart beat a little faster. Paper. The means to send a voice across the vast, silent ocean that separated her from everyone she had ever known. She bought nothing. She only stood there for a moment, breathing in the strange, sterile air of the place, before turning and pushing her way back out into the unforgiving sun. When she returned to the barracks, Haruko and two other women were sitting on their cots, mending socks. They looked up as she entered. They did not need to ask where she had been. Her face, flushed with a mixture of guilt and discovery, told them everything. "What did you see?" an older woman asked, her voice sharp. Kiku swallowed, unable to meet their eyes. She could not bring herself to mention the chocolate. It felt too frivolous, too shameful. "They have paper," she whispered instead, the words hanging in the tense, still air. "And envelopes. One could write a letter home." Kiku's words fell into the silence of the barracks like stones into a still pond. A letter home? The phrase was a dangerous seed of hope. "Hope is a trap," Mrs. Sato, a woman whose husband and two sons were on the front lines, said without looking up from her mending. Her voice was brittle. "They offer these trinkets to make us forget who we are. To accept their paper is to accept their charity. Our families would want our honor, not our letters." A younger woman near Kiku wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But what if they think we are dead? Isn't the silence worse?" The room split into two invisible camps. The older women, their faces etched with the harsh lines of duty and sacrifice, sat in rigid agreement with Mrs. Sato. The younger ones, their loss still a fresh, open wound, huddled together, their gazes drifting towards the door, towards the canteen, towards the impossible promise of a pen and paper. Haruko remained silent, her hands still. She felt the truth in both arguments. The pride Mrs. Sato spoke of was the same pride that had straightened her own back in the workshop. It was the armor of their nation. But as she looked at the tear-streaked face of the young woman, she saw a different kind of truth. She saw a fear that went deeper than war. The fear of being erased, of having the sacred thread connecting mother to child, wife to husband, simply cut. All mail would be read, of course, every word scrutinized by censors. It would be a letter written to her family through the eyes of the enemy. She closed her eyes. The faces in the barracks faded, replaced by one, her son, Kenji. She saw him as he was the last time she saw him, standing on the dock, trying so hard to be brave, his shoulders too small for the uniform he wore. He would be 17 now, if he was still. She stopped the thought. To write to him, to have him write back. It would be a confirmation that he still existed in the world, and she in his. What was honor compared to that? What was a national struggle compared to the sacred duty of a mother to know her child was alive? Dignity, she realized, was not a stone, rigid and unyielding. It was a living thing, something that had to be nurtured. To let the soul starve for the sake of an idea was its own kind of death. Her eyes opened. The hushed debate had died down, leaving a tense, unresolved silence. Without a word, Haruko rose from her cot. Every eye in the room followed her as she walked the short distance to the table by the door. Her hand, steady and sure, reached out and picked up one of the coupon books. She did not examine it. She simply held it, its flimsy paper a sudden, immense weight in her palm. The choice had been made. The next day, Haruko walked to the camp exchange alone. The coupon book felt thin and fragile in the pocket of her trousers. She was keenly aware of the unseen eyes watching her from the windows of the barracks, some hopeful, some still skeptical. Each step in the dust was a deliberate affirmation of the choice she had made for them all. She was their emissary, sent across the divide to engage in the strange commerce of their captors. The same tired soldier was behind the counter, his chin resting in his palm as he stared at the wall. The radio on the shelf played softly, a mournful song with a saxophone. The air held the same scent of soap in America. Haruko approached the counter, her heart a tight knot in her chest. She did not allow herself to hesitate. She pointed a steady finger at the pale blue writing paper and the matching envelopes. The soldier grunted, placing a small stack on the counter. Then, Haruko's eyes fell on the box of chocolate bars. She thought of Kiku's face, of the simple, youthful longing that had started all of this. She pointed to one of the bars. The soldier added it to the pile. Then came the moment she had been dreading. She pulled the booklet from her pocket and laid it on the worn wood of the counter. For a second, she expected a smirk, a flicker of triumph in the soldier's eyes. She was prepared for a small humiliation, the final price of this transaction. But the soldier merely glanced at the items, calculated the cost in his head, and took the book. With an air of profound boredom, he tore out the correct number of perforated squares. He made a small notation in a thick ledger that lay open on the counter, a meticulous record of their minor wants and needs. Then he pushed the paper, the envelopes, and the chocolate towards her and went back to staring at the wall. That was it. There was no ceremony, no shame, no victory. It was not a moral test. It was simply a purchase. The sheer bureaucratic mundanity of the act was a relief so profound it almost made her knees weak. Haruko gathered her items and walked out into the searing daylight, her mission accomplished. Back in the relative quiet of the barracks, she handed the chocolate bar to Kiku, who accepted it with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then Haruko sat on her cot and placed the small stack of pale blue paper beside the tiny, worn-down pencil stub she had carried all the way from home. The contrast was stark. One, a relic of a life that was gone. The other, a fragile bridge to a future she could not yet imagine. The blank page stared up at her, a silent, terrifying challenge. A week later, a new directive was read out after the morning roll call. Due to a shortage of local manpower, a small group of prisoners would be assigned to assist at a nearby farm. It was part of a wider government initiative to use prisoner labor to offset the wartime deficit of hands. Source: National Archives, Wartime Labor Programs. To Haruko and the others, it meant one thing. They were going outside the wire. The ride in the back of the rattling military truck was a dizzying assault on the senses. After months of seeing the world only in shades of brown dust and olive drab, the vast, pale blue of the Arizona sky was overwhelming. They passed strange skeletal cacti that reached for the sun like desperate hands and saw mountains shimmering purple in the distant heat. The world was bigger and more vibrant than they had allowed themselves to remember. The freedom was terrifying. The Gable Farm was a modest patch of determined green carved out of the ochre desert. A small, whitewashed house stood beside a field of what looked like melons. A woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a face mapped with fine lines from years of sun stood waiting for them. She wore a simple cotton dress and held a pair of work gloves. This was Mrs. Gable. She nodded to the guards, who took up positions at the perimeter of the field, then turned her attention to the women. She did not speak Japanese, and they spoke no English, but the language of the work was universal. She demonstrated how to carefully weed between the melon vines without disturbing their roots, her movements efficient and practiced. The women followed her example, kneeling in the rich, dark soil. The work was hard, their backs aching under the relentless sun, but there was a clean, honest feeling to it that the repetitive drone of the sewing machines lacked. Around midday, when the heat was at its most oppressive, Mrs. Gable disappeared into the farmhouse. The women tensed, expecting the summons for the next task. She returned not with tools, but with a bucket of water, shimmering with condensation, and a stack of tin cups. She walked down the rows, offering a cup to each woman. When she reached Haruko, she smiled, a simple, tired, human smile. "Water," she said, the word soft. Haruko accepted the cup, her fingers brushing against the farmer's calloused hand. The water was cool and clean, a shocking balm in the parched heat. It was a gesture of simple, uncomplicated decency. They had prepared themselves for hostility, for suspicion, for contempt. They had not prepared for kindness. The day passed without incident. As the sun began to dip towards the mountains, casting long shadows across the field, the guards signaled that it was time to leave. As the women gathered their things, Haruko saw Mrs. Gable walking towards her, a hopeful look on her face and something made of woven straw in her hands. The object in Mrs. Gable's hands was a simple straw hat, wide-brimmed and woven with practical skill. She held it out to Haruko, her smile reaching the fine lines around her eyes. The afternoon sun was a physical weight, and the gesture was one of pure, unambiguous sympathy. "For the heat," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "it is too much." Haruko's hands, caked with the dark soil of the farm, remained frozen at her sides, a complicated knot of gratitude, suspicion, and deep-seated etiquette tightened in her chest. To accept a gift was to incur a debt, and what debt could a prisoner repay? She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of polite refusal that felt entirely unequal to the kindness being offered. Before Mrs. Gable could press the issue, a shadow fell between them, sharp and sudden in the fading light. "Ma'am." The young guard's voice was firm. It held no anger, only the weary weight of regulation. He stood formally, his gaze fixed on a point just past Mrs. Gable's shoulder. "You know the rules. No personal gifts to the prisoners." Mrs. Gable's smile faltered, replaced by a look of tired frustration. "Corporal, it's just a hat. The sun is brutal out here." "It's contraband, ma'am," the guard stated, his voice flat. He was not arguing. He was reciting. The rules against fraternization were absolute, drilled into him since his first day of guard duty. A gift, no matter how small, was a breach. "Please, do not complicate my report." The straw hat hung in the air between them. A kindness offered, a rule enforced, a bridge that could not be crossed. Haruko looked from the farmer's weathered, soil-stained hands to the guard's polished boots, a fine layer of field dust already settling upon their shine. She understood, with a sudden, painful clarity, both of them. She saw the woman's simple wish to ease a moment of suffering, and she saw the boy's rigid adherence to a duty that allowed for no exceptions. They were both trapped in the same senseless logic of the war. Mrs. Gable's arm finally fell to her side. The hat dropped softly onto the dusty ground, a small, sad circle of shade in the setting sun. The ride back to the camp was silent. The rhythmic rattle of the truck was the only sound. No one spoke of what had happened, but the image of the hat lying in the dirt was burned into all their minds. The cautious, fragile hope that had taken root during the day had been scorched away. That evening, the silence from the truck followed the women into the barracks. It lingered through the meager meal and settled over their cots as darkness fell. The memory of the straw hat, lying uselessly in the dust, had soured the day's honest labor. "It was a trap," Mrs. Sato finally said into the gloom, her voice sharp with conviction. "A test, to see if we would take what was not allowed, to give them a reason to punish us." Another woman whispered her agreement. "Now that poor woman will be in trouble, all for nothing." Fear and suspicion began to poison the air, undoing the fragile trust that had begun to form. The women saw the guards' rigid enforcement not as procedure, but as proof of a hidden cruelty. They recalled how the Nisei interpreter had once quietly mentioned an editorial in the local paper, questioning the wisdom of the work program, citing security concerns and the impropriety of coddling the enemy. Source: Local Newspaper Archives, 1945. The guard, they reasoned, was simply acting on the hatred of his community. Haruko lay on her cot, listening. She replayed the scene in her mind, but she saw something different. She saw the guard's face, not filled with hate, but with a kind of youthful anxiety. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders as he recited a rule he did not invent. She saw Mrs. Gable's frustration, not at them, but at the invisible wall that stood between them. "No," Haruko said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the fearful chatter. The room fell silent. "You are wrong." She sat up, her silhouette framed against the moonlight filtering through the window. The boy was not angry. He was only doing his duty. The woman was not trying to trick us. She was only trying to be kind. She paused, letting the words settle. They are both trapped. He must follow his rules and she must follow her heart. And because of the war, the two cannot exist together. The fault is not in the people. It is in the war itself. Her simple observation shifted the weight in the room. It did not erase the disappointment, but it moved the blame from a person to a circumstance, from a malicious act to a tragic condition. It was an idea that offered no comfort, but it offered a sliver of understanding. The next morning, the truck ride to the farm was thick with apprehension. No one knew what to expect, but as they pulled up to the field, they saw a small pile by the gate. It was a stack of simple, unadorned straw hats, the kind one could buy cheaply at a general store. Mrs. Gable had purchased them herself, an official provision for her workers, all perfectly within the rules. She stood by the field, and as they disembarked, she simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a lesson learned by them all. That night, under the pale glow of a single bulb in the barracks, Haruko finally sat down to write. The other women kept a respectful distance, a silent acknowledgement of the importance of the moment. The blue paper, a stark, clean rectangle in the dim light, seemed impossibly vast. For weeks the goal had been to acquire this single sheet. Now that she had it, she found she had no words. What could she say? How could she describe her life in this place without causing pain? To write of the dust, the wire, the gnawing uncertainty would be a cruelty to her family. But to write of the kindness of a stranger or the surprising dignity of the work might be seen as propaganda by the censors, a reason to snip away her words with their sharp scissors. Every prisoner knew the rules. No details of location, no discussion of troop movements, no complaints, no politics. Every letter was a minefield. She picked up her old familiar pencil stub, its surface worn smooth over years of use. On a scrap of rough paper, she began to draft. "I am well." The words felt like a lie. "The food is adequate." A half-truth. "I hope this letter finds you safe." The only true thing she could think to write. She stared at the sentences, her frustration mounting. They were hollow, meaningless shells, incapable of carrying the weight of her experience. She put the pencil down and looked at her hands. They were calloused from the farm work, but the fingers were still nimble, the muscle memory of 1,000 spools of thread still intact. She thought of the sewing room, of the steady, rhythmic hum of the machines. She thought of the long, straight seams she sewed each day, a small, perfect line of order in a world of chaos. And then she knew what to write. She took up a new, sharp pencil bought from the Canteen and pulled a clean sheet of the blue paper towards her. This time she did not hesitate. She did not write about the camp or the guards or the feeling of being a prisoner. She wrote about her work. "My hands are still useful," she wrote. "I work with the needle every day. The machines are Singers, very good quality. My stitches are as straight and strong as they ever were." She wrote about the Arizona sun, describing it not as oppressive, but as a powerful, constant presence. She wrote about learning to mend heavy canvas, a new skill for her. She wrote about the person she still was, a seamstress, a craftswoman. It was a letter that told them nothing of her circumstances, but everything about her spirit. It was a message coded not in invisible ink, but in unwavering dignity. Folding the short letter, she felt a sense of peace. It was honest, it was true, and she prayed it was safe enough to cross the ocean. The seasons began to turn, a subtle shift in the angle of the relentless sun. A routine, once unthinkable, was now a source of stability. The women worked, in the sewing room and at the farm, with a quiet and steady purpose. Though coupon books, once a symbol of shame, were now a familiar tool. The women used them for small necessities that made their lives more bearable. A bar of scented soap, a new comb, a precious notebook to be used as a diary. These tiny assertions of choice were a form of quiet resistance, a way of insisting on their own humanity. They heard whispers, carried by the guards and the Nisei interpreter, that the war was nearing its end. The news was a strange cocktail of elation and terror. To go home was a prayer, but what home would be left to find? The quiet struggle was no longer against their captors, but against the despair that gnawed at the edges of their hope. Mail call was the pivot upon which their emotional lives turned. It was a bi-weekly ritual of silent, desperate pleading. Most days, there was nothing for them. But one sweltering afternoon, the Nisei interpreter walked into the barracks holding a small handful of thin, tissue-like envelopes. He read out 3 names. The third was hers. Haruko Tanaka. Time seemed to stop. She walked forward, her legs unsteady, and accepted the letter. It was flimsy, almost weightless, yet it felt like the heaviest thing she had ever held. The address was written in her husband's familiar, steady script. It had crossed an ocean, passed through the hands of countless censors, and found its way to this dusty corner of Arizona. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. The letter inside was brutally short, large sections blacked out by the thick ink of the censors, but 3 sentences remained, 3 lines that had survived the war. "We are safe. Kenji has your letter. He is proud of his mother's strong stitches." Haruko sank onto her cot, the paper pressed to her chest. He was alive. They were alive. Her message, coded in the language of her craft, a simple testament to her enduring spirit, had been received and understood. The thread she had cast out into the darkness had held. She thought of the long journey it had taken to get to this moment, the initial shame, the bitter debate, the kindness of a stranger, the quiet dignity found in a straight seam and a well-tended field. The war was not over, and the future was a terrifying blank page. But as Haruko looked out the window at the vast, indifferent landscape, she felt not despair, but a quiet, unshakable strength. She was a seamstress. She was a mother, and she was ready to go home, of course. Here is a resonant epilogue crafted in the style of a final cinematic sequence. The war ended not with a bang, but with a quiet order, and the gates of Papago Park swung open. The women, whose lives had been measured by the rising and setting of the Arizona sun, stepped out into a world irrevocably changed. They left the barracks to the silence, the sewing machines to the dust, and the memory of a straw hat to the desert wind. The coupon books. Their flimsy paper, now worthless, were left behind. Their purpose had been served, not in the purchase of chocolate and paper, but in the currency of choice, however small. What they carried with them was intangible. The memory of a farmer's kindness, the shared understanding forged in silence, and the quiet knowledge that dignity could be stitched together, thread by thread, even in the most desolate of places. They scattered back across the ocean, disappearing into the great healing work of rebuilding a nation. In the port of a scarred Nagasaki, Haruko Tanaka was reunited with a son who had grown taller but still had her eyes. She kept his reply, the flimsy, censored paper, for the rest of her life, proof that a thread, once cast, could indeed hold fast across the widest of oceans. She never knew if Mrs. Gable remembered the quiet women who worked her fields, but she and the others never forgot the woman who offered them water and a hat against the sun. For in the end, history is not only written in the grand declarations of victors and vanquished, it is also found in the texture of a pencil stub worn smooth with use, in the careful selection of words for a letter home, and in the quiet, steady work of a woman's hands, sewing a line of perfect, unbreakable stitches against the darkness.